The October wind carried the sound of piano music and raucous laughter from the Silver Dollar Saloon as Ezra Whitfield tied his horse to the hitching post outside the most notorious establishment in Deadwood Creek, Colorado. At 62 years old, Ezra rarely visited the saloon district, but urgent business with a cattle buyer had brought him to town just as the evening's entertainment was reaching its peak. The scene that greeted him as he pushed through the Batwing doors was typical of frontier saloons, gamblers hunched over card tables, cowboys drowning their sorrows in rotgut whiskey, and painted women circulating among the customers seeking companionship that could be purchased by the hour. But what caught Ezra's attention was the young woman on the small stage, dancing to the discordant piano with movements that seemed more desperate than seductive. She couldn't have been more than 19 years old, with auburn hair that caught, the lamplight and eyes that held a haunted quality despite her forced smile. Her dress was gaudy but worn, and her dancing showed technical skill that suggested formal training rather than the amateur enthusiasm of most saloon performers. "That's Ruby Sinclair," said Jake Morrison, the cattle buyer who had asked to meet. "Ezra at this unlikely location. Prettiest dancer this side of Denver, though she's got more class than this place deserves." Ezra studied the young woman more carefully, noting the way she avoided direct eye contact with the leering customers, and the defensive way she held her shoulders despite her performance persona. There was something about her that suggested she didn't belong in this environment, that circumstances rather than choice had brought her to this degrading work. "She's got breeding," Ezra observed, his experienced eye recognizing quality despite the tawdry surroundings. "What's a girl like that doing in a place like this?" Morrison's explanation revealed the harsh reality that had trapped Ruby Sinclair in a life she clearly despised. Her father was a music teacher back east who brought his family west for his health. When he died, she had debts to pay and no other skills that could earn money fast enough to keep her from starving. The casual description of desperation masquerading as choice made Ezra's jaw clench with anger at a system that offered women so few options for respectable survival that many were forced into degrading work just to eat. As Ruby finished her performance and began making her way through the crowd, accepting coins and enduring unwanted touches with practiced resignation, Ezra found himself following her progress with growing concern for her safety and dignity. "Ruby, darling, come sit with old Pete," called out a drunk cowboy whose hands wandered freely as she tried to collect tips. "I've got silver dollars that say you'll be real friendly tonight." The young woman's response was professionally diplomatic, but personally distant. "Thank you for the generous offer, Pete, but I'm only here to dance. Maybe next time you'll enjoy the show just as much." Her ability to deflect inappropriate advances without causing offense revealed social skills that confirmed Ezra's impression that she came from a better background than her current circumstances suggested. But it also highlighted the precarious nature of her position, dependent on the goodwill of men who saw her as merchandise rather than a person. The trouble began when a group of well-dressed strangers entered the saloon with the swagger of men who expected to get whatever they wanted, regardless of the cost to others. Their leader was a man in his 40s with expensive clothes and cold eyes that assessed Ruby with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating property. "Bartender, I want to rent your dancer for a private party," the man announced, pulling out a roll of bills large enough to command immediate attention from everyone in the establishment. "Name your price." Ruby's face went pale at the suggestion, her professional composure cracking to reveal genuine fear beneath her performance mask. "Sir, I'm only employed to dance on the stage. I don't provide other services. Everything has a price, girl," the man replied with cruel confidence, "and I'm prepared to pay well above the usual rate for someone with your refinement." The saloon owner, A fat man named Gus Taylor, who cared more about profit than the welfare of his employees, stepped forward with obvious greed, overriding any concern for Ruby's consent or safety. "Mr. Carmichael, for a generous gentleman like yourself, I'm sure we can arrange something special," Taylor said, his tone making it clear that Ruby's preferences weren't part of the negotiation. "I won't do it," Ruby said with quiet firmness that revealed reserves of strength beneath her vulnerable appearance. "You can fire me if you want, but I won't be forced into prostitution for any amount of money." Carmichael's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Girl, you don't have a choice in the matter. You owe money to people who don't accept refusal as an answer, and your employer here is eager to collect fees that will cover those debts." The revelation that Ruby was trapped not just by poverty, but by actual debt bondage, made Ezra understand that what he was witnessing wasn't just workplace harassment, but something approaching slavery disguised as business transaction. "They called me bait to lure customers into spending money," Ruby said, her voice breaking with humiliation and despair. "But now they want to use me for things I never agreed to do." Ezra had heard enough. Rising from his table with the deliberate movements of a man preparing for confrontation, he approached the group surrounding Ruby with the quiet authority that had made him respected throughout Colorado Territory. "Gentlemen, I believe the lady has made her position clear," Ezra said calmly, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "She's not interested in your private party, and forcing the issue would be both ungentlemanly and illegal." Carmichael's attention shifted to Ezra with the aggressive focus of a predator who didn't appreciate interference with his plans. "Old man, this is none of your business. The girl owes money, and she's going to work off that debt in whatever way her employer deems appropriate." "Is that so?" Ezra replied with dangerous calm. "And exactly what kind of debt would justify forcing a young woman into prostitution against her will?" Taylor stepped forward with ledger books that supposedly documented Ruby's financial obligations to the saloon. "She owes $300 for room, board, and clothing advances. At her current rate of earnings, it would take her 2 years to pay off that debt through dancing alone." Ezra examined the books with the sharp eye of someone who had been managing financial affairs for 40 years. What he saw was systematic exploitation designed to keep Ruby permanently indebted and therefore controllable. "These charges are fraudulent," Ezra announced loud enough for everyone in the saloon to hear. "Room and board in a flophouse and gaudy dresses aren't worth the amounts you've charged. This is debt slavery, pure and simple." Carmichael's response revealed the violence that lurked beneath his civilized appearance. "Mister, you're interfering with legitimate business arrangements. Keep pushing, and you might find yourself facing consequences you're too old to handle." What happened next became legendary throughout the territory, as the moment when Ezra Whitfield's fury at injustice overcame his usual restraint and diplomacy. Seeing a coil of rope that Taylor kept behind the bar for various purposes, Ezra grabbed it and approached Carmichael with movements so swift that the younger man had no time to react. Before anyone could intervene, Ezra had looped the rope around Carmichael's neck and pulled it tight enough to get his complete attention. "Now you, listen carefully, you piece of garbage," Ezra said with cold fury, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent saloon. "This young woman is not your property, and she's not for sale at any price. You're going to leave her alone, and you're going to leave this town tonight." Carmichael's companions reached for their weapons, but found themselves facing the business end of Ezra's Colt revolver, drawn with the speed that had kept him alive through decades of frontier disputes. "Anyone who wants to discuss this situation further is welcome to try," Ezra announced, his gun steady despite his age. "But understand that I've been protecting people from bullies and predators for 40 years, and I'm not planning to stop tonight." The rope around Carmichael's neck served as both restraint and symbol of the justice that Ezra was prepared to administer to anyone who would exploit vulnerable women. His fury at the systematic degradation he had witnessed had overcome his usual preference for legal solutions to moral problems. "Ruby, gather your belongings," Ezra called out without taking his eyes off the men he was holding at gunpoint. "You're leaving with me tonight, and nobody is going to stop you." Ruby's response revealed both her gratitude and her fear of consequences that might follow any attempt to escape her current situation. "Mr. Whitfield, they'll come after me. They have connections with law enforcement and territorial officials who profit from arrangements like this." "Let them come," Ezra replied grimly. "I've got connections too, and mine don't involve exploiting women or corrupting justice for profit." As Ruby quickly packed her few possessions, Ezra maintained his control over the situation through sheer force of will and the respect his reputation commanded even among the saloon's criminal clientele. "This isn't over, old man," Carmichael snarled as Ezra finally released the rope and prepared to leave with Ruby. "That girl represents a significant investment, and people who interfere with business arrangements in this territory don't live long enough to enjoy their heroics." Ezra's response revealed the depth of his commitment to protecting Ruby, regardless of personal risk. "Maybe not, but they live long enough to make sure decent people know the difference between right and wrong. And sometimes that's enough to change things for the better." As they left the Silver Dollar Saloon and rode into the night toward Ezra's ranch, Ruby asked the question that had been weighing on her mind since his dramatic intervention on her behalf. "Mr. Whitfield, why did you risk your life to help someone you don't even know? Most people would have minded their own business rather than make enemies of dangerous men." Ezra's answer came from moral convictions that had been shaped by decades of seeing what happened when good people refused to act against obvious injustice. "Ruby, my wife died 10 years ago, and we never had children. I've spent those years building up wealth and property, but I'd forgotten that the most important thing a man can build is a legacy of standing up for what's right. You reminded me of that tonight." The dawn that followed Ruby Sinclair's dramatic rescue from the Silver Dollar Saloon brought sobering realities to Ezra Whitfield's ranch, as both he and the young woman he had saved faced the consequences of challenging powerful men who were unaccustomed to having their business arrangements disrupted by moral objections. "Mr. Whitfield, you need to understand what kind of danger you've brought on yourself," Ruby said as they sat in his kitchen sharing a simple breakfast that was the first peaceful meal she had eaten in months. "Carmichael isn't just a customer who got angry about being refused. He's connected to a network of men who control most of the vice trade in Colorado territory." Ezra studied Ruby's earnest face, noting how different she looked in the morning, light without the paint and gaudy costume that had been part of her saloon persona. Dressed in one of his late wife's simple dresses, with her hair pulled back naturally, she revealed the refined beauty and intelligence that had impressed him despite her degrading circumstances. "Ruby, I've dealt with bullies and criminals for 40 years, Ezra replied calmly, though he took her warnings seriously. "What exactly are we facing and how do we prepare for it?" Ruby's explanation revealed the systematic nature of the exploitation that had trapped her and countless other women throughout the frontier territories. "Carmichael and his associates operate what they call entertainment enterprises in dozens of towns. They recruit women through debt bondage, false promises, or outright coercion, then move them around to prevent them from forming local connections that might help them escape." The scope of the criminal enterprise that Ezra had challenged by rescuing Ruby was far larger than he had initially realized, involving corruption of law enforcement, intimidation of potential witnesses, and violence against anyone who threatened their profitable operations. They've bought judges, sheriffs, and territorial officials in half the towns between Denver and the Utah border, Ruby continued, her voice showing the strain of revealing secrets that could cost both their lives. That's why most people don't try to help women in my situation. The system is designed to protect the men who profit from our desperation. Ezra felt his anger burn cold as he absorbed the implications of what Ruby was describing. His impulsive rescue of one woman had put him in direct conflict with organized criminals whose reach and influence might exceed his ability to protect either of them. "Ruby, I need to ask you something important," Ezra said with careful seriousness. "Do you regret leaving the saloon, knowing what we're likely to face? Because if you want to go back and pretend last night never happened, I'll understand and I won't try to stop you." Ruby's response came without hesitation, revealing the strength of character that had enabled her to maintain her dignity despite months of degradation and exploitation. "Mr. Whitfield, I'd rather die fighting for my freedom than live as a slave. To men who see me as merchandise, you gave me hope that there are still decent people in the world, and I won't dishonor that gift by surrendering without a fight." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of unexpected visitors. Sheriff Tom Bradley and two deputies approached the ranch with the official manner that suggested they were conducting business related to the previous night's events at the Silver Dollar Saloon. "Ezra, we need to discuss what happened in town last night," Sheriff Bradley announced as he dismounted, his expression revealing discomfort with his official duties. "There have been complaints filed about assault, kidnapping, and interference with legitimate business operations." Ezra felt his protective instincts sharpen as he realized that Carmichael's threats about having law enforcement connections had been accurate. The speed with which official complaints had been filed suggested that the corruption Ruby had described extended even to local authorities. "Tom, the only crimes committed last night were against Miss Sinclair, who was being forced into prostitution against her will by men who had enslaved her through fraudulent debt arrangements," Ezra replied firmly. "If you're here to return her to those conditions, you'll have to go through me first." Sheriff Bradley's discomfort was evident as he consulted his official documents. "Ezra, I've known you for 15 years, and I respect you as much as any man in this territory. But I've got sworn statements from multiple witnesses claiming that you assaulted Mr. Carmichael and abducted Miss Sinclair from her lawful employment." Ruby stepped forward with the courage that had impressed Ezra from their first meeting. "Sheriff Bradley, I wasn't abducted. I was rescued from men who were planning to force me into prostitution. Mr. Whitfield didn't assault anyone. He protected me from men who were threatening to rape me. Miss Sinclair, I have documentation showing that you owe substantial debts to the Silver Dollar Saloon and that your employment there was voluntary," Bradley replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the version of events he was being asked to enforce. Ezra's response revealed his understanding of how corruption functioned in frontier territories where law enforcement was often bought and sold like any other commodity. "Tom, those documents are fraudulent, designed to create legal justification for slavery. If you enforce them, you'll be participating in human trafficking." The confrontation that followed would determine not just Ruby's immediate fate, but the broader question of whether local law enforcement would stand with justice or with the criminal interests that were attempting to corrupt the territorial justice system. "Sheriff, I understand you've got pressure from powerful people to handle this situation in a certain way," Ezra said, with careful diplomacy. "But I also know you've got a conscience and a reputation for fairness that you've spent years building. Don't throw that away for men who profit from exploiting women." Bradley's internal struggle was evident as he weighed his official obligations against his personal knowledge of Ezra's character and his growing understanding of the true nature of the situation. "Ezra, even if what you're saying is true, I can't just ignore official complaints and legal documents," Bradley said reluctantly. "There are procedures that have to be followed, and people above my authority level who are demanding action." Ruby's intervention revealed the intelligence and social awareness that had enabled her to survive in an environment designed to destroy women's spirits and self-respect. "Sheriff Bradley, what if I were to file counter-complaints against the men who attempted to force me into prostitution? Would that create enough legal complexity to delay any action until a proper investigation could be conducted?" The suggestion demonstrated Ruby's understanding that frontier justice often depended more on procedural complications than on actual guilt or innocence, and that creating bureaucratic obstacles could provide time for truth to emerge. "That would certainly complicate matters," Bradley admitted, his relief evident at finding a legal mechanism that might allow him to avoid immediately enforcing what he suspected were unjust demands. Ezra seized the opportunity to propose a solution that might protect Ruby while satisfying the political pressures that were driving official interest in their situation. "Tom, what if Miss Sinclair were to remain at my ranch under house arrest while these legal matters are sorted out? That would satisfy your need to maintain official custody while ensuring her safety during the investigation." The compromise that emerged from their negotiations reflected the complex realities of frontier justice, where personal relationships and community standing often mattered more than legal technicalities or political pressure from distant authorities. "I can agree to supervised release pending investigation," Bradley announced, his official language masking his personal relief at finding a solution that didn't require him to return Ruby to obvious danger. "Miss Sinclair will remain in your custody, Ezra, but she's not to leave the ranch without official permission." After the sheriff and his deputies left, Ezra and Ruby faced the reality that their legal reprieve was temporary and that more serious challenges would likely follow. As Carmichael's organization mobilized additional resources to reclaim what they considered valuable property. "Mr. Whitfield, you've bought us time, but you haven't eliminated the danger," Ruby observed as they planned their next steps. "These men have resources and connections that go far beyond local law enforcement. They'll find ways to pressure you that you haven't anticipated." Ezra's response revealed the determination that had enabled him to build one of Colorado Territory's most successful ranching operations, despite numerous obstacles and setbacks. "Ruby, I didn't challenge those men on impulse last night. I challenged them because what they were doing was wrong, and because someone needed to stand up for what's right. If they want to escalate this conflict, they'll discover that an old rancher with nothing left to lose can be more dangerous than they expect." The weeks that followed tested both Ezra's resolve and Ruby's faith in the possibility of escaping the criminal network that had controlled her life. Mysterious accidents began affecting his ranch operations, legal challenges threatened his property ownership, and social pressure from corrupted community leaders attempted to isolate him from potential allies. But Ruby's presence at the ranch had also brought unexpected benefits that strengthened their ability to resist criminal intimidation. Her education and social skills made her valuable for managing correspondence and financial records, while her insider knowledge of criminal operations helped them anticipate and counter threats that might otherwise have succeeded. "Mr. Whitfield, I want you to know that whatever happens, you've already given me something more valuable than freedom," Ruby told him during one of their evening planning sessions. "You've shown me that there are still people in the world who will risk everything to do what's right, and that knowledge will sustain me regardless of how this situation resolves." Ezra's response came from growing understanding that rescuing Ruby had rescued him as well, restoring purpose and meaning to a life that had become empty and routine after his wife's death. "Ruby, when I cut that rope last night, I wasn't just freeing you from Carmichael's threats. I was freeing myself from the indifference and isolation that had been eating away at my soul for years. You've reminded me what it means to fight for something worthwhile. How will Ezra and Ruby fight against the powerful criminal network that wants to reclaim her? What allies will join their battle for justice? Subscribe to our channel to witness the incredible confrontation between one man's moral courage and a system built on exploiting the vulnerable. The spring of 1887 brought the final confrontation that would determine not only Ruby Sinclair's freedom, but also establish whether organized crime could continue operating with impunity throughout Colorado Territory. 6 months after Ezra Whitfield had cut the rope around Carmichael's neck in the Silver Dollar Saloon, their battle had evolved into a territory-wide investigation that threatened to expose corruption reaching the highest levels of government. Mr. Whitfield, we've received word that Territorial Marshal William Hayes is coming to personally investigate the charges and countercharges that have been filed in your case, announced Judge Robert Morrison, whose own integrity had made him a target for criminal intimidation since agreeing to oversee the legal proceedings. This has become much larger than a simple dispute over employment arrangements. Ezra sat in the courthouse with Ruby, now legally his ward and business partner, as they prepared for what would likely be the final legal battle in their fight against the criminal network that had controlled her life. The past months had transformed Ruby from a frightened saloon dancer into a confident advocate whose testimony had helped expose systematic corruption throughout the territory. Your Honor, we're prepared to present evidence that the so-called employment arrangements were actually slavery disguised as debt bondage, Ruby said with the articulate intelligence that continued to impress legal professionals. I have documentation showing how women throughout the territory have been trapped in similar situations through fraudulent contracts and intimidation. The investigation that Ruby had helped initiate had revealed the scope of criminal enterprise that Ezra had challenged when he rescued her from the Silver Dollar Saloon. Dozens of women had come forward to testify about their experiences with forced prostitution, debt slavery, and official corruption that protected their exploiters. Miss Sinclair, your courage in speaking out against these practices has enabled us to build criminal cases against individuals whose activities have corrupted justice throughout Colorado Territory, Marshal Hayes told Ruby during his preliminary investigation. But you should understand that testifying against such powerful opponents carries serious personal risks. Ruby's response revealed the strength of character that had enabled her to survive months of degradation while maintaining her dignity and moral clarity. Marshal Hayes, the greatest risk would be remaining silent and allowing other women to suffer what I suffered. Mr. Whitfield taught me that sometimes standing up for what's right is more important than staying safe. The criminal trial that followed became a watershed moment in territorial justice as the full extent of organized crime's penetration into local government was revealed through testimony from victims, witnesses, and even some perpetrators who agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Prosecutor Samuel Richardson addressed the packed courtroom. The evidence will show that the defendants operated a criminal enterprise that reduced human beings to property, corrupted law enforcement for profit, and used violence to silence anyone who threatened their illegal activities. Carmichael and his associates had assembled a legal defense team that included some of the territory's most expensive attorneys, but their strategy of attacking the credibility of witnesses was undermined by the sheer volume of corroborating testimony from multiple sources. The prosecution claims that Mr. Carmichael forced Miss Sinclair into prostitution, defense attorney Harrison Wells argued. But the evidence shows only that she was employed as a dancer under standard contract arrangements. Her allegations of coercion are unsupported by physical evidence. Ruby's testimony in response to such attacks revealed both her intelligence and her determination to ensure that justice would be served, despite attempts to discredit her character and motivations. Mr. Wells, the physical evidence you're demanding would require me to have been physically brutalized before my testimony about coercion would be considered credible, Ruby replied with composed anger. But coercion doesn't require physical violence when it's backed by economic desperation, legal threats, and the knowledge that law enforcement has been corrupted to protect the perpetrators. The turning point in the trial came when Ezra was called to testify about his decision to intervene in Ruby's situation and his subsequent investigation of the criminal network that had controlled her life. Mr. Whitfield, what motivated you to risk your life and property to help someone you barely knew? Richardson asked. Ezra's answer revealed the moral philosophy that had guided his actions throughout the confrontation. When I saw what was being done to Miss Sinclair, I realized that staying silent would make me complicit in her degradation. My late wife always said that the measure of a man's character isn't what he does when people are watching, but what he does when he's the only one who can help. The defense's cross-examination attempted to portray Ezra as a vigilante whose actions had undermined legal procedures and endangered public safety, but their arguments were weakened by his obvious sincerity and the respect his reputation commanded throughout the territory. Mr. Whitfield, don't you think that taking the law into your own hands sets a dangerous precedent for frontier justice? Wells asked during his cross-examination. I think allowing criminals to operate with impunity because they've corrupted official procedures sets an even more dangerous precedent, Ezra replied steadily. When the system fails to protect innocent people, decent citizens have an obligation to step in and do what's right. The jury's verdict was unanimous and swift, guilty on all major charges, including human trafficking, official corruption, and conspiracy to commit violent crimes. The sentences that followed effectively dismantled the criminal network that had operated throughout Colorado Territory for years. The court finds that the defendants operated a systematic criminal enterprise that reduced human beings to property through fraud, intimidation, and corruption, Judge Morrison announced during sentencing. Such activities strike at the foundation of civilized society and will be punished with the full severity of territorial law. But perhaps the most significant outcome of the trial was the precedent it established for protecting vulnerable individuals against systematic exploitation, and the recognition that private citizens had both the right and obligation to intervene when official systems failed to provide justice. What Ezra Whitfield and Ruby Sinclair accomplished extends far beyond winning a single legal case, observed Territorial Attorney General James Patterson during the ceremony, recognizing their contributions to law enforcement reform. They proved that individual moral courage can challenge and defeat organized crime when it's backed by determination and community support. The broader impact of their victory was evident in the legislative reforms that followed, establishing stronger protections for women against economic coercion and creating oversight mechanisms designed to prevent the kind of official corruption that had enabled systematic exploitation. The Whitfield-Sinclair Act, as the comprehensive anti-trafficking legislation came to be known, established legal frameworks that were later adopted by other territories and eventually by federal authorities as the West developed more sophisticated approaches to criminal justice. As Ruby's 21st birthday approached, bringing with it full legal independence and the opportunity to build whatever life she chose, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from desperate exploitation to respected advocate for social justice. Mr. Whitfield, when you cut that rope around Carmichael's neck, you weren't just freeing me from immediate danger, Ruby said, as they celebrated the completion of her legal studies and her appointment as Colorado Territory's first female prosecutor. You were cutting the rope that bound all women to lives of economic desperation and legal helplessness. Ezra's response came from the heart of a man who had discovered that the greatest achievements in life came from using power and privilege to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Ruby, when I saw what was being done to you in that saloon, I realized that all the wealth and property I'd accumulated meant nothing if I wasn't willing to risk it to defend basic human dignity. You gave my life meaning and purpose that I'd lost when my wife died. The ranch that had served as Ruby's refuge during the legal battles became the foundation for an organization that provided similar protection and advocacy for other women facing exploitation throughout the developing West. Their success had created both resources and expertise that could help others escape similar situations. We've proven that individual acts of courage can grow into movements that change entire societies, Ruby told a gathering of territorial women's advocates during the 5th anniversary celebration of their legal victory. But it requires people who are willing to risk comfortable indifference to fight for justice, even when the odds seem overwhelming. Years later, when historians wrote about the transformation of frontier justice and the development of women's rights in the American West, they would trace many advances to an October night when an old rancher's fury at injustice led him to cut a rope and challenge a criminal system that had seemed untouchable. The Silver Dollar Saloon was eventually converted into a school for girls whose families couldn't afford traditional education, while Carmichael and his associates served lengthy prison sentences that ended their careers in human exploitation. From desperate victim to pioneering prosecutor, Ruby's incredible transformation shows how one person's courage to intervene can change not just individual lives, but entire legal systems. Ezra's decision to cut the rope of oppression created ripples of justice that protected countless others from exploitation. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of moral courage that challenges injustice and the amazing power of standing up for those who cannot stand up for themselves.